Madam Speaker. As always, a great honor to rise in this House, as I've done many times over the past 20 years. I mentioned the 20-year mark in that I have always been a great political optimist, a great believer in Canada, a belief in our fundamental goodness to work things out. But we are in a very dark time for democracy. We see the rise of disinformation, conflict, social, in all aspects of life. On the international stage, the uncertainty coming out of Putin's aggression, the mass killing of innocent people in Palestine. And I don't feel that this House of Commons rises to what Canadians expect us to be. Too often we are dealing with very profound issues through glib press releases or slogans that, and bumper sticker politics. But every now and then we are confronted with legislation that forces us to go deeper. And this legislation is certainly such a moment, because there is nothing more profound in the human community than birth and death. And how we address the rights of people as they're dying and the supports that need to be in place defines not just who we are as a society, but right down to who we are as families, as neighbors, as spouses, as parents, as children. And we're in a very unfortunate moment, I think, in terms of the failure to put the guardrails in place to protect people at this most profound moment. The issue of MAID is a very personal issue, and it's of societal importance that we get this right. I have certainly struggled with this issue, and I've wanted to make sure that what was done for the benefit of all, in the best interests of the human community, of the right of the individual, but the right of the people that love them to be part of something special. You know, I'm coming up on the anniversary of my sister Kathleen's passing, and nobody blew through our family more like a summer storm than my sister Kathleen, and nobody suffered greater pain than I've ever seen. And she was fearless right up to the end. Kathleen was always there to the very end, wanting one more gathering, one more song, one more story. And Kathleen would never have accepted MAID, because her will to live was so powerful, even as she knew she was not going to live. And I don't say that to say that her death was any more profound than anyone else's. This was her choice of how she went, and how she went was our choice. My mother said the rosary. I sang Danny Boy. That's how we do things in our family. And we had one of those great Celtic wakes afterwards. And there were people at that Celtic wake who'd never even met my sister, but they all told stories about her. And that's the way we do things in the Celtic tradition. But I've also had friends phone me who had cancers that they could not beat, who phoned me to say goodbye because MAID allowed them the opportunity to choose with their family and their community a dignified way to go, and I respect that. I think that's a very profound choice. And so when Parliament was confronted with the need, because of the Supreme Court ruling, to put in place a regime, we put the regime in place and then said that there would be a review. Because we needed a review, because we were going to a place we had never been to as a society. The review would be in place after we saw how MAID was working. Was it working the way it was supposed to? Were there abuses? Were the rigors that Parliament said had to be put in place not paid attention to? And then we had the Quebec Superior Court decision, the Truchon decision. And I felt at that time that it was the obligation of the federal government to appeal that. And I'm not going to argue the merits of the Truchon decision, but the obligation of the federal government to make sure that if we were going to apply this at the national level, that we had really had done all the due diligence, but that wasn't done. So the Liberals moved a change to MAID before the review that was supposed to happen. And so already suddenly things were changing from what we'd agreed on. And then our colleagues in the Senate And I will never say much positive about the Senate, but today I will certainly say how dismal and appalling the attitude of the senators were. Stan Kushner, who I had to sit with on the special committee, the disrespect, the arrogance of people who are not elected, people who have no accountability, people who do not have to go back to their communities when they're dealing with a suicide crisis like I have to and other people have to, who said, we want an arbitrary date to extend MAID to people suffering from mental illness and depression. That was such an extraordinarily outrageous and poorly thought out overreach that it was the job of the Parliament of Canada to simply say no. All the other provisions MAID would have stayed in place. But that didn't happen. What happened is that the Liberals agreed. And then it dawned on them that we were going down a very dangerous road and things hadn't been thought out. My colleague from Abbotsford, who I've sat on many committees, and we probably disagree on a lot in politics, but we share the same integrity of coming to this House to do the right thing, bringing what we can bring to bear. He brought legislation to deal with this provision, and it was voted down. So now we're some 30 days from a profound change in legislation that would change Canada forever, and we're scrambling. We're scrambling on a question of life and death and body autonomy. This is not how we should be dealing with these issues. I use the word body autonomy because it's one of the profound human rights. The right to control your body, the right to make a decision. But it's not an absolute right. There are societal factors that go into that right. And when someone is deeply, deeply depressed, someone is suffering mental illness, someone who feels alone, their body autonomy has been compromised, their ability to make decisions. And it's really important for us to always remember that nobody dies alone. They may die in grief, they may die in isolation, they may die in the blackest hole of their own personal pain. But the impacts of that death affects family, it affects neighbors, it affects people beyond what the poor person who suffered that dark moment could ever understand. If you've ever sat down and worked with people whose loved ones were lost to suicide, they want to say again and again, if only they knew how much they were loved. In the northern communities that I work in, where we've had children as young as 10 years old giving up and killing themselves. What kind of nation sits back and lets children give up hope at age 10? I would have thought that when we had those kind of suicide crises in Cross Lake and Attawapiskat and Pakanjikam and Wapakika, you can't even mention how many of those communities have suffered it. That there would be a national consensus to go up and say, what do we have to put in place? But that doesn't happen. So when I sat on that special committee and I heard some of the medical experts say, we've been really pleased that the Liberal government has put in place all the steps necessary to help this through. I was thinking, you're putting resources in place to push ahead the ability of someone who's severely depressed to make a decision to die without having to have their loved ones, their family, their spouse even, without having a second opinion. You do that, but you would not put in place the broader supports that we need for mental illness. And this is not a whataboutism issue. This is about the crisis that we're facing, where we face 4,000 suicide deaths a year in this country. The mental health crisis is extreme. In 2016, I brought the National Palliative Care Strategy because it's not applied fairly across the country. And when you can't die in dignity, it is a terrible thing. The palliative care approach, and we talked with doctors and nurses across the country, and the federal government agreed and said, yes, we'll put a strategy in place to work with the provinces and the territory, and nothing was done. In 2019, I brought the Motion 174 and a national suicide prevention plan that was based on the incredible work that was done in Nunavut. We know that Quebec put a suicide prevention plan in and cut the suicide rate by 50%. Because these factors are not difficult to find the patterns of where the suicide clusters form, in terms of areas of age, in terms of areas of economic crisis. Once you start to map it out, and that was part of what the suicide action plan would be, that Parliament would provide the resources that we could start to map out where these crises occur so we can put the mental health services in place. That's what we need to be doing as a Parliament, instead of scrambling at the 11th hour to come up with a fix, a temporary fix, another temporary fix on a temporary fix, on a decision that was put forward by an unelected, unaccountable Senate that had no backing, no credibility, no support, other than the fact that a couple of arrogant senators who've never been elected, have no accountability, decided that Parliament would go along with this, and the government put up with that. It was an absolute failure of public policy to let the unelected senators like Pamela Wallin and Stan Kushner dictate health policy for people in crisis. We would never allow that for anything else. And yet here we are, 30 days from the deadline. You know that we've had letters, 7 out of 10 provinces, saying, do not do this. We've had the medical community say, we have no way to even properly assess. Do not do this. We have had really profound, thoughtful witnesses come forward to talk about the complexities of issues of mental illness. And that who is one to say whether it is irredeemable? Who is one to say that this suffering is so bad it warrants death when there are options? And we have also the situation of people in increasingly desperate situations who feel alone. It says who we are as a society, that we say, yeah, that's really too bad that you're homeless. It's really too bad you're suffering the nightmare of addiction. It's really too bad you're a young person in a northern Indigenous community and you have never, ever been able to get proper medical attention. But if you want to die, we'll set up a process. That's not what MAID was meant for. MAID was meant to deal with people who could make the choice, an informed adult choice, as they suffered pain that could not go away. That they could make that choice with their loved ones and their family. I remember my good friend Liz from Vancouver Island, who called me. We were good friends. She used to drive me around Vancouver Island in this old Jaguar with wood paneling that she got for $4,000. I kept saying, Liz, if this car breaks down on the mountain, I'm not going to have to get it and push it up to the other side, am I? Liz played blues music for me in that car. She talked about the Catholic saints, and she talked about queer politics. She was her own person, and she smoked. And as she was dying, she called me and said, this is the moment, and I'm taking the moment because this is the last moment I may have to make that decision. That was a very profound way to go. That's what MAID is for. MAID is not for people who feel they have no hope. To be able to go through without a backup, without a robust multidisciplinary team to walk through the issues with them. It's not something that you can, as they said, make a second choice. I think of Dr. Valerie Masuda, the palliative care physician, said to the committee, if this special joint committee on MAID recommends proceeding with allowing access to MAID for chronic mental conditions, I would recommend there be a robust multidisciplinary review process involving physicians, psychiatrists, social workers, and ethicists involved in a patient's MAID application, and that there be a transparent review of MAID cases shared between health authorities and provincial and federal oversight, so that we ensure we are not treating social problems with euthanasia. Amen, sister. Imagine if someone with mental illness and depression was able to get a multidisciplinary team of physicians, psychiatrists, social workers, ethicists. Well, we wouldn't have a mental health crisis because those people are not there. Those teams are not there. The government made a commitment to transfer to the provinces $4.5 billion in mental health to deal with the crisis that's unfolding before us. And they haven't done that. So again, we're in a situation where we're being asked to vote. And this bill that the Liberals are bringing forward, it's gutless. Because it's going to punt it down the road 3 years. We're going to be back here in 3 years. We punted it down the road a year. Over the fundamental failure of the former Attorney General, who simply let it pass. The Senate made a completely unreasonable, undemocratic, unwise pronouncement that overrode the work of the democratically elected House of this country. A House that, as dismal as we are sometimes and dumbed down and sloganeering and fighting over the stupidest things, we have to go back to our constituents and talk to them. We have had to go to the funerals of people who've died from suicide and from depression. We bring that experience into this House. And we can disagree on the extent of MAID, we can disagree on many things, but we have a democratic right and a duty to do the right thing here. The Senate has no democratic accountability to anyone. So the fact that we are having to pick up the pieces from their arrogance and the failure of the Liberal government to hold them to account is, I think, concerning, and we need to reflect on that. And I would urge the members in that other chamber, do not play games with this. March 17th, the deadline changes. The law of Canada changes. The amount of people who could die without proper support, it would change forever. The legal framework of Canada. So my message to those unelected senators, do not play games with the work that we're doing. We're picking up the pieces. We're trying to fix the damage that they did. And we need to do this because it's a bigger principle that's at stake here. The stake of human dignity in a country. And we have to also extend this conversation to our failure as a nation. Our ongoing failure on mental health. Our ongoing failure to offer young people a better future. Our ongoing failure to recognize that the weakest ones in our society, if they're just allowed to die and kill themselves because there's no hope, then we have failed, and we are failing. So I would like to think that we can come together across party lines and say there has to be guardrails. There has to be guardrails that protect the autonomy of the individual, but also places the individual who's in mental crisis and depression within the context of their family, of their loved ones, of their society. Because when you die alone and you die in darkness, the effects are felt for years and years and years after. And I will conclude on this, Madam Speaker. Going into some communities after a suicide crisis, it's like you're walking into shock waves of grief that play out for years and years to come. And it takes so much work to come back from that for a community, for a family. Here we are as a society making that decision. So let's do this right, and let's do this with respect for the people who expect us to do the right thing. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires.